Are you connecting me through to a QI?
That's what I'm getting right now, is seeing who is on call, and I'm going to get you right to them. Give me 1 second, sir. I'm going to put you on a quick hold. So 1 moment, please. Your rank?
Ship's master.
Okay, thank you. Ship's name?
El Faro.
Spell that? E-L?
Oh, man. The clock is ticking. Can I please speak with a QI?
Got it, sir. Again, I'm going to give you reach right now. 1 moment, please. Hi, good morning. My name is Just give me 1 moment. I'm going to try to connect you now, okay? Mr. Davidson?
Okay.
Okay, 1 moment, please. Hi, thank you for waiting.
God.
Just really briefly, what is the problem you're having?
I have a marine emergency and I would like to speak to a QI. We had a hull breach, a scuttle blew open during a storm. We have water down in 3 holes with a heavy lift. We've lost the main propulsion unit. The engineers cannot get it going. Can I speak with a QI, please?
Yes, thank you so much. 1 moment.
What you just heard was a recording of the phone call from Captain Michael Davidson of El Faro on October 1st, 2015. Despite his relatively calm demeanor, his ship and crew were in extreme peril. This recording is from the Voyage Data Recorder, or VDR, recovered from the wreck of El Faro in 2016, and contained just over 26 hours of data. In addition to voices on the bridge, it also recorded data such as position, speed, heading, and radar images. This data provided investigators with a wealth of information to piece together the events leading up to El Faro's tragic sinking. The loss of El Faro was one of the worst civilian maritime disasters in United States history, and the worst commercial shipping disaster since the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1975. El Faro, the clock is ticking. Today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. The ship that would eventually be named El Faro was built in 1975 by the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company of Chester, Pennsylvania. First named the Puerto Rico, she was built as a roll-on, roll-off cargo ship, one of 10 such Ponce-class ships built by Sun. As built, she was 14,000 gross tons, 643 feet long, 92 feet wide, and was owned by the Puerto Rico Maritime Shipping Authority and operated by Naviadas de Puerto Rico Steamship Company. A roll-on, roll-off type of cargo ship is designed to have vehicles drive directly into the ship's hold and on the deck, or both. Automobiles, motorcycles, and tractor-trailers are driven onto the ship and then driven off when the ship reaches its destination. In comparison, container ships are loaded and unloaded using large cranes. Commonly shortened to row-rows, roll-on, roll-off ships have historically shown stability issues. So much so that within the shipping industry, row-row has come to mean roll-on, roll-over. Between 1975 and 1991, the SS Puerto Rico operated between its island home and the east coast of the United States, transporting various goods. In 1991, the ship was purchased by Saltchuk Resources, the parent company of Totem Ocean Trailer Express, or TOTE, and renamed to Northern Lights. Operated by Sea Star Line, a subsidiary of TOTE, her new duties often took her between Tacoma, Washington, and Anchorage, Alaska. In 1992, the ship underwent a conversion at the Atlantic Marine Shipyard in Mobile, Alabama. A 90-foot addition was added, which included an additional cargo hold and a spar deck. The Northern Lights continued operating between Washington and Alaska until the ship was chartered by the United States government in 2003. Under the Jones Act, The United States Armed Forces are permitted to call upon U.S.-flagged merchant vessels to provide sea lift for military personnel, vehicles, and supplies. The Northern Lights came under missile fire in March of 2003 while in the Persian Gulf. Despite some near misses, the ship suffered no damage. The Northern Lights made 25 voyages and 49 port calls for the U.S. military before the end of its charter in 2006. After her time serving the military, Todt reassigned the ship to its subsidiary company, Sea Star Lines, and was renamed El Faro, meaning the lighthouse. At this time, the ship went through another conversion, as it was transformed into a hybrid roll-on, roll-off, and container ship, or a ROCON. First considered a major conversion by the Marine Safety Center of the United States Coast Guard, Todt appealed this ruling. A major conversion is subject to a much higher level of inspection and testing, as the ship is considered in effect to be a new vessel. A new vessel has to be in compliance with all standards in place at the time of the conversion, and Todt well understood that a major conversion meant costly repairs, upgrades, and delays. Their appeal was upheld on the grounds that similar changes to the Todt ships El Yunque and El Morro were not considered to be major conversions. During the conversion, El Faro's load line was raised by 2 feet, meaning more of the ship would be underwater, and the surface of the water would be closer to the ship's deck. It also meant she could take on more cargo, meaning higher profits. These changes impacted the ship's stability, as she was originally designed to be a fast, sleek, ro-ro ship, and was now expected to carry containers stacked high on her main deck. Following her conversion, El Faro was laid up by Todt from 2008 to 2011, and then placed out of service entirely in Baltimore. Todt had experienced a setback in 2012 when customs agents in Jacksonville found 7 kilos of cocaine on board the El Morro, a sister ship. Some of the unlicensed crew on board who were hired through the union were responsible for the drugs, but Todt made 4 officers scapegoats, including 2 captains and 2 chief mates, and all of them were experienced, knowledgeable mariners. One of them, Captain Jack Hearn, was the captain of El Morro at the time of the drug bust. However, prior to this, Todt considered him a bit of a troublemaker. Captain Hearn was extremely unhappy with the poor condition of his ship, and frequently reported the need for major repairs. When those requests went unanswered, he informed the Coast Guard. Officially, Hearn was fired because of the drugs found on board, but it does raise suspicion of whether this was retribution for being a whistleblower. Todt was also suffering declining profits due to a drop in cargo prices due to an increase in supply and a glut of cargo ships. The economy of Puerto Rico was of particular importance to Todt, and the island's finances were in turmoil. The territory was in the midst of a horrible recession and was under a massive debt. Unemployment and a decreasing population made matters even worse. In 2015, Todt's main competitor in the Puerto Rican trade, Horizon Lines, was sold, and its service to Puerto Rico was discontinued. Todt had been routinely undergoing cost-cutting measures, including reducing its workforce, and open positions on the ships and in the ports remained unfilled or were eliminated entirely, causing more work for a shrinking crew to perform. 2 experienced shipmasters suddenly resigned, citing safety concerns, demotions, and the shifting around of officers. Those who remained at Todt sought positions on the new LNG ships, calling the old Ponce-class ships old rust buckets. El Faro's sister ship El Morro was scrapped in 2012 after being deemed structurally unsound, and the other, El Yunque, was scrapped in 2017. 53-year-old Captain Michael Davidson had spent his entire lifetime either in or around the water. A native to Casco Bay, Maine, he spent his childhood watching the ferries and ships come and go, eventually joining Casco Bay Lines as a deckhand while still a teenager. He would go on to graduate from the Maine Maritime Academy in 1988 and worked with Casco Bay Lines as a ferry boat captain. Davidson was a knowledgeable mariner, confident, and ambitious. As a deck officer with ConocoPhillips in the Pacific Northwest, Davidson left a threatening voicemail for another officer who he believed was in the way of his promotion. Davidson was subsequently fired as a result. In 2005, he signed on with Todt, and served with Todt for 5 years before leaving for Crowley Maritime. He later resigned from Crowley, although the company claims he was fired, when he ordered tugs to guide his ship into port against company wishes when the ship lost its steering. In 2015, he returned to Tote, but this time only as a third mate. While he was awaiting assignment at Tote, Davidson applied to be the master of one of the new LNG ships, and he was strongly considered. At one point, Tote had decided to give Davidson the job, but at the last minute, an email was received from the company's crewing manager, stating she had, quote, dwindling confidence in his abilities as a leader overall. Tote's port engineer Jim Fisker Anderson wrote of Davidson, "He's a stateroom captain. I don't think he knows what a deck looks like, period. Least engaged of all 4 captains in the deck operation. He's great at sucking up to office staff." As Davidson waited to hear if he would get his promotion, he became more and more frustrated as he saw others around him getting promoted. After another Tote captain was forced out, Davidson was asked to return as the master of Faro. This was not the assignment he wanted. Faro was effectively an aging rust bucket that was destined to be scrapped before long, but he begrudgingly accepted the job. Those who served under Captain Davidson describe him as outgoing and gregarious, and overall a nice guy. But he was also known for being a bit arrogant, meticulous, and a bit by the book, and a cautious captain. At 12:42 p.m. on September 28, 2015, Faro docked at Pier 32 at the Blunt Island Terminal in Jacksonville, Florida, returning from a trip to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and the ship immediately began to be loaded for another trip to San Juan. The chief mate is responsible for the proper loading of a ship, and up until September 1, 2015, Tote had provided port mates in Jacksonville and San Juan. But port mates in Jacksonville were eliminated as part of cost-cutting measures. As a result, the crew of Faro had a difficult time keeping up with the loading of the cargo. At one point, the terminal manager saw that Faro was listing to starboard, describing it as the greatest list he had ever seen while loading cargo, and he took a photograph. He ordered the stevedores to shift more of the cargo to port, and the list was corrected. Faro's unique cargo layout after her conversion made it more difficult to load her properly. The data was loaded into ship loading software called CargoMax, and the problem resulted from a misplaced decimal. In total, Faro was loaded with 391 containers, 238 refrigerated containers, or reefers, 118 trailers, 149 cars, and 6 large tanks of high-fructose corn syrup. In all, Faro carried 25 million pounds of cargo. At 10:36 p.m. on September 28th, the National Weather Service issued an advisory upgrading a developing tropical depression to Tropical Storm Joaquin, located 295 nautical miles northeast of San Salvador, moving southwest at 4 knots. The next morning, off-duty second mate Charlie Baird saw the weather report and sent a text message to Davidson, warning him of the danger. Baird later testified, "He came back to me and said yes, and thank you. When I saw it had developed into a Category 1 hurricane, I texted him again to ask him what his plan was going to be." Davidson sent his reply, stating he would steam our normal direct route, and that he would slip under it to the south. Baird then reminded Davidson of several alternate routes to the west that were available to him that may be safer. Just a month prior, Davidson faced a similar situation when Tropical Storm Erica threatened his route. Davidson chose to switch to a safer route to the west called the Old Bahama Channel. This took them out of danger, but it added 6 hours to their voyage and used 504 additional gallons of fuel. As preparations for departure were made, a port engineer boarded Faro and had dinner with Captain Davidson. During the conversation, they discussed the weather alerts regarding Tropical Storm Joaquin. Captain Davidson made it clear he was not concerned about the storm, and he didn't mention any plans to change the ship's usual route. Most of the discussion was about the engineer's upcoming work on Faro. This was going to be our final voyage on the Puerto Rican run before returning to the Washington to Alaska route. Faro was scheduled for dry dock in Tacoma in December of 2015, where she would be converted back into a ro-ro vessel. 5 Polish contractors were on board as a riding crew to begin the conversion work, while Faro made the round trip to San Juan. These men were not given basic safety training before joining Faro. Additionally, repair technicians from Harding Safety repaired the clutches on the starboard and port lifeboat davit systems while the ship was being loaded. These repairs were not reported to the Coast Guard or the American Bureau of Shipping prior to El Faro departing Jacksonville on September 29th. Before departure, Captain Davidson downloaded a weather update from the Bon Voyage System, or BVS. This is a service offered by Advanced Weather Technologies and provides updates using data from the National Weather Service. Every 6 hours, it sends graphical displays of anticipated weather along the planned route of the ship. These updates were regularly sent to the captain's email address and downloaded using the ship's Inmarsat email system. Captain Davidson then had to manually forward the email to the bridge in order for it to be used for navigation. Advanced Weather Technologies also offered a subscription-based service to provide routing recommendations based on weather patterns, and a BVS tropical update, which automatically sends updates regarding dangerous tropical storms directly to ships. Tote did not subscribe to either of these services in 2015. At 8:06 p.m. on September 29th, El Faro pulled away from the Blunt Island terminal and entered the St. Johns River with pilot Eric Bryson in command. This was about 1 hour later than its planned departure. Bryson was a seasoned veteran pilot, having navigated ships in and out of Jacksonville for the St. John's Bar Pilot Association for 24 years by this time. He was also very familiar with El Faro, having guided her and her sisters El Maro and El Yunque dozens of times over the years. The 70-minute voyage to the sea buoy was uneventful, but Bryson and Davidson had some discussion about Tropical Storm Joaquin. Davidson knew the storm was out there, but said it's a fast ship. The storm will make a hard turn to the north soon, and they would shoot under it. At 9:48 p.m., Bryson disembarked to the pilot boat, and Davidson resumed command. There were a total of 33 on board, including officers and crew. In addition to Davidson on the bridge of El Faro were Chief Mate Stephen Schultz, Second Mate Danielle Randolph, Third Mate Jeremy Ream, and helmsmen Frank Ham, Jackie Jones, and Jack Jackson. The National Hurricane Center's 11 p.m. update on September 29th indicated Tropical Storm Joaquin was predicted to stay on a southwesterly course for the next 48 hours and would continue to strengthen. This was contrary to prior models showing a turn to the north, as Davidson was hoping. As a result of this southwesterly track, a hurricane watch was issued for the central Bahamas. Just 30 minutes later, Davidson downloaded this update from the BVS. There was no mention in Davidson's position reports of any change in El Faro's planned route. By early morning on September 30th, Joaquin was upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane. Davidson downloaded the update from the BVS at 6:08 a.m., but this update erroneously contained the same track as the update from 4:51 p.m. the previous day. This meant Captain Davidson and his crew were looking at data that was more than 12 hours old. Complicating matters, the ship's voyage data recorder captured the bridge crew discussing the malfunctioning anemometer, which measures wind speed and direction. It consistently and inaccurately measured a wind direction of 180 to 193 degrees throughout the voyage. In fact, it had been malfunctioning for months, and according to the chief mate, Tote was not going to replace it. But the BVS system was functioning, and El Faro was relying on it for accurate weather data. The BVS used data from the National Hurricane Center and processed it into its own reporting system, which was passed on to the ships. This process takes several hours, so the data Davidson was looking at, including the incorrect track, was roughly 12 hours old. Davidson still believed he could easily slip south of the storm without altering course much, telling his chief mate Stephen Schultz, "It's tracking as the written weather has it. It's gone a little south. This is why you watch the weather all the time. You can steer a little bit more away from it, a little more away from the center." This was just a slight course change of 7 degrees to the south. Captain Davidson, seeing the sunrise, stated, "Oh, look at that red sky over there. Red in the morning, sailors take warning." Davidson and the chief mate were satisfied with the course adjustment, calling other options drastic, and saying, "That would be the action for some guy that's never been anywhere else. We'll just sit on the bank and fish for trout." Just a few minutes after making this course change, El Faro received a PAN, or urgent message from its Inmarsat satellite system. This message indicated Joaquin would be within 50 nautical miles of San Salvador within 24 hours, with wind speed up to 75 knots, gusts up to 90 knots, and seas up to 27 feet. The area included in this warning was directly in El Faro's course. Despite Davidson's confidence, he was certainly not ignoring the weather, instructing the chief mate to let the crew know there will be some rough weather ahead. At 7:49 a.m. on October 1st, the National Hurricane Center issued an intermediate advisory. Joaquin was now officially a hurricane, with wind speeds up to 65 knots, or about 75 miles per hour, and located just 400 nautical miles from El Faro's position. Unfortunately, El Faro did not receive this advisory on its SAT-C system because intermediate advisories were not scheduled to be broadcast to the SAT-C. Not realizing Joaquin was already a hurricane, Third Mate Jeremy Ream told Chief Mate Schultz that the storm would probably be a hurricane later today or tomorrow, and Schultz pointed out that the storm was heading further south and west than originally expected. At 8:31 a.m., Captain Davidson returned to the bridge and told the bridge crew, "Tough to plan when you don't know, but we made a little diversion here. We're going to be further south of the eye. We'll be about 60 miles south of it. It should be fine. We're going to be fine. Not should be, we are going to be fine." Davidson described the ship as solid and held up to Tropical Storm Erica just a month prior. Third Mate Ream agreed, but replied, "The ship is solid. It's all the associated bits and pieces. The hull itself is fine." Davidson just replied, "We're going to make it. We're going to make it." On board the northbound El Yunque, Captain Kevin Stith had realized previous predictions of the storm's track were proving to be incorrect, and he sped up to stay north of it. He sent an email to Davidson at 9:52 a.m., warning him of the storm's position and continued track to the southwest. 15 minutes later, Second Mate Danielle Randolph emailed her mother, writing, "We are heading straight into a hurricane." As concerns on El Faro were intensifying, so was Hurricane Joaquin. The National Hurricane Center issued another advisory at 10:53 a.m., warning of sustained wind speeds of up to 80 miles per hour and gusts up to 98 miles per hour, and the storm was now 330 nautical miles southeast of El Faro. This advisory was received by El Faro's SAT-C, but as of yet, no further course changes were ordered. Davidson then replied to Captain Stith on El Yunque. "I've been watching this system for the better part of a week. We did alter our direct route slightly more to the south, which will put Joaquin 65 nautical miles to the north of us at its closest point of approach. Fortunately, we departed the dock in Jacksonville on time last evening, and making 20 knots doesn't hurt either. All departments have been duly notified, and we should be on the backside by 0800. In fact, El Faro left an hour late, not on time, as Davidson wrote. Second Mate Danielle Randolph was growing more and more concerned and frustrated with Davidson, stating, "He's telling everyone down there, oh, it's not so bad. It's not even that windy out. Seen worse. I think he's just trying to play it down because he knows we shouldn't have come this way. Saving face." In one of the more tense moments from the voyage data recorder, Davidson informed Second Mate Randolph that he requested permission from Tote Management to take the Old Bahama Channel on the return to Jacksonville. Randolph was a bit incredulous that Davidson would even ask permission, given the dangers of the storm. Davidson was anxious to get approval from Tote, trying to stay in their good graces, as he was still hoping to get a job on one of the new LNG ships. Randolph responded to Davidson sarcastically, "Does the company want to give permission now? Because it used to be just, we're doing it. You people are sitting in your office behind a desk, and we're out here. We're doing it." Davidson, not liking her tone, answered, "I'm extending that professional courtesy because it does add 160 nautical miles to the distance." Officially, Tote did not prevent captains from making course changes while at sea, and allowed them to use their best judgment. But the shipping industry runs on tight schedules, and the captains are pressured to keep them, and Davidson didn't want to do anything to upset Tote management at this time. At 2:14 p.m., a message was received from the United States Coast Guard on Channel 16, the Emergency Distress Channel, warning all ships that the Bahamian government had issued a hurricane warning for the Central Bahamas and for mariners to use extreme caution. Both Davidson and Randolph exclaimed simply, Wow. The captain then told his second mate, "So by 2 o'clock tonight, on your watch, you should be south of this monster." Randolph asked permission to steer clear of danger while on her watch, and Davidson just reassured her that he would be up the entire night to help her if needed. When Davidson left the bridge, able seaman Jackie Jones stated nervously, "It's all whitecaps out there right now, and the swells are growing." Roughly an hour later, El Faro's radar picked up the El Yunque speeding north away from the storm. Jones commented, "Nobody in their right mind would be driving into it." Randolph, nervously laughing, replied, "We are." When Jones insisted to the captain, "We are going right into it," Davidson confidently corrected him, 70 miles south of it. At 3:45 p.m., third mate Jeremy Ream arrived on the bridge for the change of watch, and second mate Randolph advised him that the swells were unchanged. An hour later, the National Hurricane Center issued another advisory, indicating Joaquin was still moving southwest at 7 knots, and growing more intense with sustained winds up to 86 miles per hour, and gusts over 100 miles per hour. Danielle Randolph continued to be frustrated. El Faro was 212 nautical miles from the eye of the storm. She pointed to the charts and showed Davidson that the storm would be directly over them between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. Exasperated, she exclaimed to the captain, "We are going to go right through the eye." At 5:47 p.m., Davidson downloaded an update from the BVS, and the data was identical to that received on the SAT-C from 11 a.m. that morning. El Faro also received an urgent high seas forecast at 6:24 p.m. over the SAT-C, warning of seas between 12 and 27 feet within 90 nautical miles of the eye, and seas of 30 feet by noon the following day. Davidson had just received a response from Tote, giving him permission to use the Old Bahama Channel on the return route. But many on board were hoping Davidson would use it now and avoid Joaquin entirely. To use the Northwest Channel Passage through the Bahamas, which was the only channel left available to them for some time, they would need to turn to the west as soon as possible. Helmsman Frank Ham nervously asked, "Is there a chance we could turn around?" It was rare and almost unheard of for a helmsman to question or even discuss a ship's route with officers on the bridge. Annoyed, Davidson sharply replied, "No, we're not going to turn around. We're not going to turn around. The storm is very unpredictable." With rough seas jostling and rocking the ship, the crew had to continually check the hatches, or scuttles, and tighten down the cargo. At 6:48 p.m., Chief Mate Schultz sent crew members down to the cargo hold, reminding them, "You know those scuttles need to be dogged, not just flipped down. They need to be spun and sealed." There's no indication of why the chief mate issued this reminder, but it does give the impression that perhaps in normal conditions, the crew did not always close and seal the hatches. At 7 p.m., with the sun now giving way to the night, Captain Davidson and Chief Mate Schultz decided to make a slight change to El Faro's course, from 140 to 150 degrees, pointing the ship a bit more to the south. This new course would take El Faro to the west of San Salvador, offering a small amount of relief. However, it did put a little more distance between the ship and the storm. Davidson told Schultz, "You don't necessarily have to go down the Old Bahama Channel. There's lots of places to duck into." At 7:43 p.m., third mate Ream arrived to take over the watch. He had been watching Weather Underground TV and was not happy about what he saw, announcing, "I just hope Joaquin's not worse than what BVS is saying, because I just watched Weather Underground and it's saying a lot. More like 85 miles per hour, not 50 like on BVS. They're saying this is much more powerful than the BVS is saying right now." This seemed to annoy Davidson, snapping back, "We'll be passing clear on the backside of it." Before leaving the bridge, Davidson told Ream he would be awake the entire night and to call him if things get bad, adding, "I told the office to expect us at 8 o'clock in the morning in San Juan." Third mate Jeremy Ream and able seaman Jack Jackson exchanged concerns about being so close to the storm, and they discussed being caught in the storm and being blown into shallow waters within the islands. As the two discussed options in case the worst happened, Ream questioned Davidson's decisions, but then quickly gathered himself and showed support for the captain, saying, "This guy's been through a lot worse than this. He's been sailing for a long, long time. He did it up in Alaska." Jackson replied, I'll never have faith in these assholes like I used to. At 10:29 p.m., the National Hurricane Center announced Joaquin was now a Category 3 hurricane and moving toward the central Bahamas, with maximum sustained winds of 115 miles per hour. As this was another supplementary advisory, El Faro did not receive it, and would not learn of the upgraded storm status until 2.5 hours later when they heard it on the radio broadcast. Third mate Jeremy Ream was correct. Hurricane Joaquin was far stronger than what their data was indicating. Armed with this new information, the third mate spoke to Davidson on the phone at 11:13 p.m., telling him, at 0400 we'll be 22 miles from the center, with max 100 mile per hour winds with gusts to 120 and strengthening. At 0200 we could head south and that would open it up some. But Davidson was having none of it. After getting off the phone, Ream told Jack Jackson, "He seems to think that we'll be south of it by then, so the winds won't be an issue. What he's saying is, well, we'll be in the southwest quadrant. Wind will be coming from the north. I trust what he's saying. It's just being 20 miles away from 100-knot winds. This doesn't even sound right." At 11:51 p.m., second mate Danielle Randolph and able seaman Jackie Jones entered the bridge to take over the watch, and were told to stay on course at 150 degrees. Jones said he was getting his survival gear ready. Jack Jackson summed up the mood saying, "We're the only idiots out here." Tension was mounting on the bridge. El Faro was heading directly into the eye of a Category 3 hurricane, and their captain refused to change course. Another high seas urgent alert was received from the Ocean Prediction Center at 12:17 a.m. on October 1st, reporting 115 mile per hour winds and gusts up to 140 miles per hour. Second mate Randolph and third mate Ream studied the charts, discussed alternate routes again, including the old Bahama Channel, before Ream headed down to his cabin. Danielle Randolph continued to pore over the charts, desperately seeking a safe and navigable route away from the storm. At 12:41 a.m., she told able seaman Jackie Jones, "I may have a solution. At 2 o'clock we'll be in a good spot to alter course south to 186 degrees. That course line keeps us 5 miles away from any kind of shallow area. This course could get us away from Joaquin, go south, get away from it, and connect with the old Bahama Channel right into San Juan." Randolph was not confident about Davidson accepting her plan and was hesitant to wake him up. It was now 1 o'clock a.m., and despite his promise that he would be awake all night and ready to help, he didn't check in with the bridge. It was at this time the crew finally learned that Joaquin was a Category 3 hurricane, after hearing it on the radio. This news was hours old already, and the storm was predicted to reach Category 4 and approach the eastern edge of the Bahamas before turning north. At that moment, a large wave crashed into the side of El Faro, rocking the vessel. Jackie Jones shouted, "Whoa, biggest one since I've been up here. It'll break the ship in half." Outside, winds were at 63 miles per hour with 14-foot seas. There was no more time to waste, and Danielle Randolph called Captain Davidson at 1:20 a.m. and informed him of the situation. She offered her solution to take El Faro even more southward, away from the storm and into safer waters. After explaining her plan, there was a long pause as he gave his answer. "Okay," she said, "I'll adjust course to 116. Davidson rejected her plan outright, and to her shock and dismay, he ordered a course change to 116 degrees, sending El Faro on a more easterly course, directly into the eye of the storm, 40-foot waves, and over 130 mile per hour winds. The ship's VDR recorded a solemn exchange at 2:47 a.m. when Jackie Jones stated, "I figured the captain would be up here." "I thought so too," replied Randolph. "I'm surprised. He said he was going to come up." As El Faro set on her new course, she inched closer into Joaquin's fury. Giant, angry waves crashed into the ship and over the bow. She rolled and creaked and groaned as she rose the crests and dove into the troughs, and her speed was cut to just 16 knots as she fought the wind and current. All over the ship, items were breaking loose and rattling around. From deep in the cargo hold, loud thumping could be heard as cargo was breaking loose. Those off duty hunkered down in their cabins wearing life jackets as the ship was tossed like a toy, making sleep impossible. The strong winds were now causing the ship to heel, making steering more difficult. As condition worsened, the conversation on deck turned to safety procedures, life jackets, and their emergency gear. Second mate Randolph commented, "It would help if I knew which direction the swells were coming from. I could alter course a little more. Can't see." At 2:53 a.m., an alarm on the bridge rang out, indicating the ship was off course. Despite adjusting the course, the alarm sounded again at 3:20 a.m. "We're getting into it now," said Randolph. "It's just getting bigger. Our path is going right through it." With the ship heeling badly to starboard from the wind, Randolph adjusted the course once more to 110 degrees, a bit to the east. At 3:45 a.m., Chief Mate Schultz rejoined the bridge for the change of watch. He changed the course again to 100 degrees, and a few minutes later to 95 degrees, almost due east. Danielle Randolph was now off duty, but she continued to be concerned. At 3:52 a.m., she emailed a friend, writing, "So we are heading into the hurricane right now, full force. Tried to alter our course to avoid it, but he's on the warpath. Bad seas and really bad winds. Hope to talk to you Friday." She then messaged her mother. "Not sure if you have been following the weather at all, but there is a hurricane out here, and we are heading straight into it. Category 3 last we checked. Winds are super bad, and seas are not great. Love to everyone." The off-course alarm continued to sound as the ship careened through larger and larger waves. Green water poured over the ship's exterior deck, battering the cargo containers. When the helmsman asked about the wind speed, Schultz replied, "I don't have any idea. We don't have any instruments that can measure it." Down on the second deck, the cords to one of the refrigerated containers were cut, causing the third assistant engineer on duty to go to the bridge to inform the chief mate. At 4:09 a.m., Captain Davidson finally arrived on the deck, telling everyone that he slept like a baby. "This is every day in Alaska," he said. "A typical winter day in Alaska." The ship was still losing speed, and now only traveling about 10 miles per hour. Davidson checked with the engineers, and they confirmed the engines were operating at the normal RPMs and reported no problems. But Davidson asked the engineers to give it a little more, but he was told, "This might be as high as it's going to go." Davidson went to the galley to check if everything was secure, while the chief mate called the engine room to remind that the weather decks, or those exposed to the outside, were secured, and he didn't want anyone coming up to the bridge from the second deck, as the third assistant engineer had just done. El Faro was continuing to heel significantly from the force of the winds and current, so much so that one of the containers on the second deck was leaning over. Meanwhile, Chief Engineer Richard Pusateri was monitoring a growing problem in the engine room. The heeling of the ship was causing the oil in the sump to shift like water in a glass as it tilts. To reduce the effect of this heeling, Davidson and Chief Mate Schultz made a series of course changes, pointing El Faro's bow directly into the wind at 60 degrees to the northeast, to try to give the engineers time to correct the oil pressure. Davidson downloaded the BVS update at 4:45 a.m. The update was available at 11 p.m. the night before. The data in this report was identical to the data received the previous evening. His delay in downloading the data added to the usual 5 to 6 hour lag of the BVS, and this meant Davidson was looking at the weather forecast from almost 12 hours prior. Hurricane Joaquin now had sustained winds of 120 miles per hour, with gusts up to 150 miles per hour. El Faro was now just 11 nautical miles from the storm's center. Attempting to counter the heeling of the ship to starboard, at 4:46 a.m., Captain Davidson took over the helm to steer the ship himself, and changed the course again to 60 degrees, which slowed the ship to about 9 miles per hour. Minutes later, Davidson asked, "Did we lose a container or something? A trailer down on 2 deck?" He then ordered another course change to 50 degrees, steering the ship more north before heading down to check on the cargo. The series of course changes had not corrected the heeling of the ship. It was at this time Davidson realized the data contained from the BVS was inconsistent with weather data he was getting from other sources. In fact, all of the weather sources were providing an incorrect position of the center of the storm. The captain wanted to get back on course, and believed the worst was over, saying, "Only gonna get better from here. We're on the backside of it." The chief mate informed him the ship still had an 18-degree list to starboard, and sailing at just 5.8 knots, or roughly 7 miles per hour. But Davidson was wrong. They were, in fact, in the most violent part of the hurricane surrounding the eye, and its barometric pressure had dropped to 948 millibars, meaning an even stronger hurricane. At 5:10 a.m., the riding supervisor of the Polish engineering crew, Jeffrey Matthias, arrived on deck, saying things were slapping around down on the second deck, and reported a low oil pressure warning sounding in the engine room. He told Davidson, "I've never seen it like this. I've never seen it hang like this." And both men continued to discuss how the listing of the ship had affected the oil pressure in the engine. By 5:21 a.m., winds were gusting up to 120 miles per hour, and the storm had almost stalled, moving at just 4 knots. At 5:30 a.m., a canopy attached to the bridge was torn away, and the wind direction changed to almost head-on. Chief Mate Schultz reported the stern was now taking on water. In addition, the government of the Bahamas issued a hurricane warning for Acklins, Crooked Island, and Mayaguana in the southeastern Bahamas. 5:43 a.m., Captain Davidson received a phone call from the crew reporting water in hold number 3 and ordered Chief Mate Schultz to go down and assess the problem. Before leaving the bridge, Schultz phoned down to the crew and ordered them to use the bilge pumps, but the bilge pumps were already operating and the water level was continuing to rise. Schultz could be heard on the VDR asking someone in the engine room, "So that's where the water is from? Are we able to pump the bilges?" It was determined a suspected leak from an open scuttle had been the source of the water entering hold number 3. The scuttle must have been left open at some point, or possibly damaged during the storm, but this open scuttle was allowing water from the crashing waves to gush down to the second deck, into hold number 3. Davidson then ordered water to be pumped from the starboard tank to the port tank in order to correct the list, which was still at 18 degrees. By this time, El Faro's speed had dropped to just 2.8 knots or about 3 miles per hour. Schultz, who had gone down to investigate, reported back to Davidson that the water in hold number 3 was knee-deep and was pouring down through the scuttle. What was previously thought to be healing from the wind was now discovered to be a list from the many thousands of gallons of water pouring into the ship's hold. Davidson and Matthias discussed the problem and decided to turn the ship so the wind would hit the starboard side. He announced on the bridge, "I'll get it going in that direction and get everything on the starboard side to give us a port list, and then we'll be able to get a better look." Davidson spoke to Schultz on the phone, saying, "We got it listing over to port now. Can you see it down there, the water level?" Schultz and Matthias investigated more closely and observed water pouring down into hold number 3. Davidson then informed second mate Danielle Randolph, "A scuttle popped open and there's a bit of water in 3-hold. They're pumping it out right now. No big deal." Pumping water from the starboard tank to the port tank, along with a course change slightly to the northwest, El Faro now had a list to port. Moments later, Chief Mate Schultz reported they had secured the scuttle on deck 2. At 6 a.m., multiple phones can be heard ringing on the bridge. Davidson picked up the call from the chief engineer, listened for a moment, and responded, "All through the ventilation?" Chief Engineer Pusateri reported water was pouring through the ventilation system, which consisted of open vents. The engine room was flooding and threatened to knock out the ship's propulsion entirely. The oil pressure was still low and not improving, despite Davidson's attempts to correct the list. Schultz returned to the bridge to brief Davidson, and was ordered to return to hold 3 to monitor the water level and to check on the cargo. El Faro was now in serious trouble. With knee-deep water in hold 3 from the open scuttle, a list to port, and water pouring through the ventilation, the ship also now lost its radar. Davidson instructed a crew member, "See if you can get that radar to come back up." Second Mate Randolph then informed Davidson that an alarm was going off in the engine room, and the ship's speed had noticeably dropped. Randolph, who was not on duty at the time, thought for a moment to return to her cabin, but instead asked Davidson if he would like her to stay. "Please," he replied. "Down to 950 millibars," noting the low pressure. "Feel the pressure dropping in your ears just then?" Helmsman Frank Ham was not as collected as Davidson and Randolph. He was noticeably nervous and growing more so every minute, prompting Davidson to tell him, "Take your time and relax. Don't worry about it. Stand up straight and relax." 6:09 a.m. Davidson downloaded another BVS update, which had been available at 5 o'clock a.m. The information matched the data received on the SAT-C at 10:53 p.m. the previous night. A moment later, Schultz called up from Hold 3, and Davidson ordered, "Transfer over to the starboard ramp tank, port to starboard ramp tank," trying to shift the ballast to correct the ship's list to port. Davidson then said, "I'm not liking this. I think we just lost the plant." The captain called down to the engine room and asked, "Any chance of getting it back online?" Engineers were desperately pumping water from the engine room and Hold 3, trying to normalize the oil pressure to increase speed. Just then, El Faro was smashed by the biggest wave yet, jolting the ship harshly. The vehicles chained down in the holds broke free and slammed against the hull. This violent force rolled El Faro even farther to port, getting dangerously close to being capsized. With El Faro rolling severely to port, the oil pressure was lost completely, initiating an emergency shutdown of the engine. El Faro lost all propulsion and was helplessly adrift at only 0.5 knots in 36-foot seas and gusts up to 150 miles per hour. Without propulsion, they could not steer the ship. Davidson made several calls below to make sure the pumps had suction and were operating, and it was confirmed all pumps were working, but not fast enough. Third Assistant Engineer Mike Holland reported it would take hours to pump the water out of the hold. What nobody on El Faro knew was that water had been gushing into the hold from the ship's fire pump below the water line on the starboard side. This was used to pump water into the fire prevention system when needed, and engineers could open and close the valves. Any damage to this system, such as a broken pipe or valve, would instantly cause a high pressure flow from underwater, through the pipes, and into the ship. 160 gallons of water per second were pouring into El Faro, while its pumps, if actually working properly, could only pump 16 gallons of water per second. Despite the catastrophe unfolding, Davidson did not yet sound the general alarm. Danielle Randolph was ordered to wake third mate Jeremy Ream and then draft an emergency message, but just as a precaution. The captain ordered all crew to be up and ready. Randolph prepared the emergency message as ordered, reporting flooding, cargo adrift, time, and the vessel's position, and the messages were ready to be sent. Davidson told her, "Not yet." Davidson called the chief mate, who told him the engineers are getting the oil pressure back up. He relayed this information to the helmsman, saying, "They're getting that boiler back up. They're getting lube oil pressure up." But no data indicates El Faro's speed or direction had changed, indicating it still had no propulsion. Dawn broke as El Faro was being tossed, pushed, and battered by Hurricane Joaquin. Outside, a damaged loose handrail ripped away and disappeared into the sea. Helmsman Frank Ham noticed water dripping from the bridge ceiling. Unconcerned, Davidson reassured him. "Nah, that's okay. Don't worry about it." Captain Davidson left the bridge at 6:52 p.m. and went to his office. He returned just a couple minutes later, reporting, "A scuttle was left open or popped open or whatever, and there was a significant flooding in Hold 3. But he had no plans to abandon ship, despite describing their situation as dire straits." He assured the crew on the bridge that the engineers would get the engines running again. At 7 a.m. on October 1st, Davidson called Tote's designated person on shore, John Lawrence. Lawrence was Tote's safety and operations manager, and also a former captain. Lawrence was dressing for work at the time and just missed answering Davidson's call. Getting Lawrence's voicemail, Davidson left the following message. "Captain Lawrence, Captain Davidson. Thursday morning, 0700. We have a navigational incident. I'll keep it short. A scuttle popped open on 2 deck, and we were having some free communication of water go down the 3-hold. Have a pretty good list. I want to just contact you verbally here. Everybody's safe, but I want to talk to you." Davidson then called Tote's emergency call center. The recording of that call is what you heard at the beginning of this episode. Davidson was calm, but anxious, and clearly frustrated by the process of getting through to Lawrence as the operator asked for his information and clarification. Finally, at 7:07 a.m., Davidson was put through to Lawrence. He gave Lawrence the details of their situation, describing a very, very healthy port list, and adding, "The engineers cannot get lube oil pressure on the plant, therefore we've got no main engine. The crew is safe. Right now we're trying to save the ship. our safest bet is to stay with the ship during this particular time. The weather is ferocious out there. We're in survival mode right now." When Davidson hung up with Lawrence, he ordered Second Mate Randolph to send the distress messages she prepared. At 7:13 a.m., Randolph sent the messages and also activated the SAT-C distress signal and the Ship Security Alert System, or SSAS. Davidson said, "Well, all hell's gonna break loose with the messaging and stuff like that." After a pause, he suddenly and rather angrily ordered, "Wake everybody up, wake 'em up." Then, almost as if he was trying to convince himself, he commented, to nobody in particular, "We're gonna be good. We're gonna make it." 7:14 a.m., and each minute the situation grew more desperate. Chief Mate Schultz reported, "I think the water level's rising. Something hit the fire main, got it ruptured. I came in here and dogged that door tight." He was probably referring to the door on the fourth deck. Davidson answered, "Don't open it." 7:16 a.m. The alarm for hold number 2A on the fourth deck rang out, meaning it too began to flood. According to Schultz, nobody checked hold number 2A. In hold 3, cars and other vehicles were now floating in the floodwater. The fire main was directly below, underneath many feet of water at this time. Davidson wanted the fire main to be isolated by securing the valve controlling the suction, as, quote, "that may be the root of the cause of the water coming in." With chest-deep water now on second deck, Davidson stated, "We're not in good shape right now." He could not get the ship's list under control, and still had no propulsion. Meanwhile, John Lawrence had relayed the El Faro situation to the United States Coast Guard, and sent the following to Tote Management. El Faro, emergency, 49 miles east of San Salvador. Took on water. 15 degrees list. Ingress stopped and pumping water. No main engines. Heavy winds and 15-foot seas. Coast Guard notified. In fact, at the time of this email, the list was far greater, and seas were over 30 feet. 7:27 a.m. Davidson sounded the general alarm, alerting all crew to report for an emergency and to muster on the starboard side. Finally, at 7:29 a.m., Davidson gave the order to abandon ship, and the ship's VDR captured a bell ringing 7 times. Danielle Randolph can be heard shouting, "I got containers in the water," and Davidson yelled, "Tell them we're going in." Randolph then ran to get life vests for herself and Davidson, and one more for Frank Ham. At 7:30 a.m., Captain Davidson announced, bow is down," and he ordered the life rafts thrown overboard, and the crew to board them. He told them all to get off the ship, but to stay together. The life rafts were being used, but no discussion of launching the actual lifeboats ever took place. It is likely the ship's list of over 25 degrees made launching the antiquated lifeboats impossible. Coast Guard District 7 in Miami contacted designated person ashore John Lawrence at 7:33 a.m. After reviewing the information provided, specifically that the flooding had been secured and El Faro was being pumped, it was determined El Faro was not in distress. Lawrence was also told that since El Faro was in international waters and not in distress, Tote was responsible for providing tugs or other assistance. However, the Coast Guard Command Center did attempt to contact El Faro, but was unsuccessful. Lawrence later testified, "It was far more serious than it first came across to me." He was extremely calm and professional, along with the second mate when she gave the position, referring to Captain Michael Davidson and second mate Danielle Randolph. The last minutes of the VDR captured Davidson trying to locate life jackets and encouraging able seaman Frank Ham, who was repeating, "Going down, I'm a goner." "No, you're not," replied Davidson, urging him to head for the life rafts. At 7:39 a.m., a low rumble emerged on the recording. The last words recorded on the VDR were Davidson telling Frank Ham, "It's time to come this way." El Faro's emergency position indicating radio beacon, or EPIRB, sent a transmission at 7:39 a.m. and was received by the Coast Guard. But El Faro was not equipped with a GPS beacon, and the message simply stated, "Unlocated first alert." According to the VDR data, its last position was 20 nautical miles of Samana Cay, about 17 nautical miles from the center of Hurricane Joaquin. According to the National Hurricane Center, Joaquin was a Category 4 hurricane by 8 o'clock a.m. on October 1st, with wind speeds over 130 miles per hour. 2 Air National Guard planes who were monitoring the hurricane reached out to El Faro over VHF radio, but could not make contact. The strong winds and violent seas made search and rescue attempts extremely difficult. A Coast Guard C-130 from the Clearwater, Florida Coast Guard Station was dispatched on October 2nd and flew into the storm, experiencing a terrifying loss of 900 feet of altitude in an instant when entering the eye. The aircraft made several passes through the storm, looking for red immersion suits, lifeboats, survivors, and debris, only giving up when their planes started to tear apart in the high winds. 3 Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopters, 2 cutters, Air National Guard aircraft, an Air Force C-130, and a Navy P-8 soon joined the search. The crew of the C-130 spotted a debris field off Cricket Island, and a Jayhawk helicopter was sent to investigate. A Coast Guard rescue swimmer recovered 3 life rings with the name El Faro on one of them. The following day, October 3rd, an Air National Guard plane spotted an oil slick and debris field in the area. On October 4th, a total of 7 aircraft searched 30,581 square miles. By October 5th, the cutters Resolute and Northwind, along with 3 tugs chartered by Tote, were able to reach the area, with the storm having moved to the north. A crushed fiberglass lifeboat was discovered, along with 2 life rafts from El Faro. None of them contained survivors. That same day, a crewman on a Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter spotted a person in the water wearing a survival suit, and a rescue swimmer entered the water to investigate. The individual was deceased and could not be identified. If they recovered the body, the Jayhawk would have to immediately return to base. Instead, they dropped a buoy with a GPS locator at the location and continued searching for survivors. Unfortunately, the GPS malfunctioned and the location was lost, along with the body. On October 5th, the Coast Guard declared El Faro as sunk and focused on searching for survivors in the water, but none were found. The search for survivors was suspended on October 7th. A week later, all crew on board El Faro were declared missing and presumed deceased. On October 31, 2015, the United States Navy vessel Apache discovered an object 3 miles underwater using side-scan sonar and a remote-operated vehicle. And on November 16th, the vessel was confirmed as El Faro. After 2 unsuccessful attempts by the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, to locate the voyage data recorder, the U.S. Navy again used the Apache and found the VDR on August 5, 2016, 10 months after the sinking. The U.S. Coast Guard and the NTSB both placed much of the blame on Captain Davidson in their investigation reports. The NTSB report states, "The probable cause of the sinking of El Faro and the subsequent loss of life was the captain's insufficient action to avoid Hurricane Joaquin, his failure to use the most current weather information, and his late decision to muster the crew. Contributing to the sinking was ineffective bridge resource management on board El Faro, which included the captain's failure to adequately consider officers' suggestions." But Tote itself was heavily criticized by both organizations, citing a lack of safety standards, outdated and malfunctioning equipment, inaccurate weather observations, and lack of appropriate survival craft, specifically the outdated open-air lifeboats. The NTSB also found fault with the Coast Guard's decision to not require masters and chief mates who were licensed before 2014 to receive the updated severe weather training. The Coast Guard also grandfathered El Faro with regard to its lifeboats, only holding it to the standards from 1974. El Faro had 2 open-air, manually propelled, gravity-launched lifeboats on each side of the ship, instead of the stern-launched, closed lifeboats that newer ships required. In total, the NTSB issued 53 safety recommendations regarding the sinking, with NTSB chairman adding, "I hope that this tragedy at sea can serve as a lighthouse to guide the safety of marine transportation." Former crew members of El Faro were critical of the ship and of Tote. One former crewman asked why the company did not do more to help navigate El Faro away from the hurricane, and added, he and others spent hours every day scraping buckets and buckets and buckets of rust off the ship. Former able seaman Marvin Heerman III described, "It's like taking a 40-year-old car to New York. It's scary. You don't know if you're going to make it." Heerman, who knew many of those on board El Faro, added, "I'm wondering why the company didn't worry about 33 lives while a hurricane was coming." Tote released a statement of their own regarding the investigations, stating, "We as a company intend to learn everything possible from this accident and the resulting investigations to prevent anything similar from occurring in the future." Maritime law professor at Fordham Law School and retired U.S. Navy Captain Larry Brennan stated of the accident, "El Faro was a worn, aged ship which succumbed to heavy weather in large part because of multiple unseaworthy conditions, poor leadership, and bad decisions by the captain, American Bureau of Shipping, the owners, as well as inadequate surveys and inspections by the U.S. Coast Guard." Captain Davidson was a good, solid, and responsible captain, and he was not known for taking unnecessary risks. We will never know what drove him to take the actions he did, and there were many events leading up to the sinking of El Faro, some minor and some serious. Compounded together, the fate of the 33 crew on board El Faro was sealed. We mourn the loss of these mariners, and I hope this episode, in a small way, helps honor their memory. The vast majority of the information used in this episode was obtained from the United States Coast Guard Marine Casualty Report, the NTSB Accident Report, and the tremendously detailed book Into the Raging Sea by Rachel Slade, which I highly recommend. You can find links to these sources, as well as the names of El Faro's crew, and photographs relating to this story on shipwrecksandseadogs.com. That's going to do it for the story of El Faro. The clock is ticking. Thank you so much for listening. You can follow Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs at ShipwrecksPod on social media or at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Please remember to rate and review if you like the show. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him at sean.siegfried.se. Please join me again in 2 weeks. And until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.